Have you ever wondered why some people can achieve everything they once prayed for and still feel like they're falling behind? Why no compliment sinks in, no success feels real, and no amount of love ever feels enough? Today, we're diving into the darker psychological roots behind chronic inadequacy, the hidden wounds, the silent conditioning, and the invisible expectations that shape people most people who grow up feeling like they're never enough don't recognize the moment it starts. There is no single dramatic event, no clear memory of someone turning to them and saying, "You're inadequate." Instead, it forms slowly, quietly, through thousands of subtle psychological impressions that accumulate over years. It begins in the shadows of early life, inside households where love may have been present but inconsistent, where validation was conditional, or where a child learned that their value depended entirely on how well they performed, behaved, or pleased others. This is where the never enough identity takes root. In environments that unknowingly train the mind to believe that worth must be earned rather than inherently possessed. Children are incredibly observant, far more than adults give them credit for. When a child grows up watching a parent who is emotionally distant, overly critical, or impossible to please, the child internalizes a dangerous message. If I can't make them happy, something must be wrong with me. Over time, that message becomes a foundational belief, shaping how they interpret every interaction. Even parents with good intentions can unintentionally reinforce this pattern. A simple shift in tone, a distracted response, or a lack of acknowledgement during important moments can be enough to plant seeds of self-doubt. The child begins to develop an internal metric, one where love, praise, and safety must be earned through achievement, perfection, or compliance. As these children grow older, their brains become wired to seek external validation as their primary form of emotional grounding. They learn that approval feels like oxygen, and without it, they suffocate in silence. If they bring home a good grade, but the parent only asks why it wasn't perfect, the child learns that excellence is merely the baseline, not something to be proud of. If they express feelings but are told they're being dramatic, they learn that emotions are inconvenient and should be hidden. If they achieve something, but no one seems to care, they start to believe their accomplishments don't matter. And eventually, this evolves into a deeper belief: I don't matter. This becomes the template for their adult relationships, their career choices, and even the way they speak to themselves in moments of stillness. The tragedy is that many people who feel chronically inadequate were never openly discouraged or intentionally harmed. Instead, they grew up in what psychologists call emotionally thin environments, places where basic needs may have been met, but emotional needs were often overlooked. In these environments, a child can feel invisible. They learn to become hyper-attuned to the emotional needs of others while completely disconnected from their own. This hypervigilance is a survival mechanism. The child watches for the slightest shifts in tone, body language, or mood to avoid conflict, disappointment, or rejection. As adults, this turns into overthinking, perfectionism, and a constant fear of failure. They never stop scanning the room for signs that they might be falling short. Another root of the never enough mindset lies in comparison, especially in families where siblings were favored differently or where achievement was publicly celebrated but emotional struggles were dismissed. When one child receives praise for being the smart one, the responsible one, or the talented one, the others silently absorb the belief that they are something less. The comparison may not have been spoken, but it was felt. And feelings, especially in childhood, become the architecture of self-identity. Later in life, these individuals find themselves constantly comparing their progress, appearance, or success to those around them, always coming up short regardless of reality. Some people inherit this mindset from caregivers who themselves struggled with chronic inadequacy. When a parent feels unfulfilled, insecure, or emotionally starved, they may unintentionally pass that burden onto their children, not by words, but through behaviors. The way they criticize themselves out loud, the way they reject compliments, the way they downplay their own success, or the way they constantly worry about being judged. Children internalize this model of self-doubt and repeat it unconsciously as adults. The narrative becomes intergenerational. We are the kind of people who aren't enough. Breaking this cycle requires awareness, something most families never develop. In dark psychology, chronic inadequacy is often linked to subtle forms of emotional manipulation, not because the manipulation was always intentional, but because it created patterns of dependence, guilt, or pressure. A child might learn that their role is to keep the peace, impress the adults, or carry the emotional burden of the household. This pushes them into a premature sense of responsibility, and they grow up equating their worth with how useful they are to others. When they cannot meet impossible expectations, they blame themselves. They don't realize the expectations were flawed. It's easier to believe I failed than to believe my environment was unsafe or inconsistent. As adults, these individuals often have difficulty accepting love, compliments, or recognition. When someone expresses admiration, they feel exposed, as though the praise is based on a misunderstanding. They fear that at any moment, the mask will fall and people will see the truth, the inadequacy they've been running from their entire life. Their relationships reflect this emotional imprint. They either attach to partners who mirror the coldness of their early caregivers, repeating the cycle, or they choose partners who give them the praise they crave, only to sabotage the relationship because it feels unfamiliar or undeserved. They do not trust acceptance. They only trust struggle. This relentless self-criticism becomes an internal voice, one that whispers through every achievement, every relationship, every moment of joy. Even when life is going well, the voice says, "You could have done better. You're not there yet. Don't celebrate. Don't relax. You haven't earned it." People who live with this voice often mistake it for ambition or discipline, but in reality, it's fear. Fear of being abandoned, ignored, or unimportant. This fear masquerades as motivation, but it never brings peace, only exhaustion. Understanding the origins of chronic inadequacy is not about assigning blame. It's about recognizing the quiet psychological patterns that shape the human experience. People who feel like they're never enough are not weak, dramatic, or overly sensitive. Most people don't realize that the mind is wired to prioritize threats over truths, fear over facts, and pain over peace. For someone who constantly feels like they're not enough, this bias becomes even more pronounced, so deeply ingrained that positivity, reassurance, and praise feel almost foreign. When the brain has learned to expect disappointment, criticism, or rejection, anything that contradicts those expectations feels suspicious. This is where the darker side of psychology becomes visible. The very mechanisms meant to protect the mind end up working against it, distorting reality in ways that keep a person trapped in inadequacy. The center of this pattern is the brain's negativity bias. It's an ancient survival mechanism designed to keep us alert to danger. For people who grew up in environments where emotional threats were common, such as unpredictable caregivers, inconsistent affection, or criticism disguised as guidance, this bias becomes hyperactive. The mind begins to scan every situation for signs of judgment or failure. A neutral expression becomes a disapproving one. A delayed message becomes rejection. A simple mistake becomes a confirmation of inadequacy. The brain magnifies every negative detail while ignoring positive ones, creating a psychological world where the person is always falling short. When the brain is conditioned this way, positive experiences trigger an internal conflict. Compliments don't match the negative self-image the mind has rehearsed for years, so they're instantly dismissed. Achievement feels hollow because the brain is already searching for what could have been done better. Even moments of happiness are overshadowed by a voice whispering that it won't last. This is not a lack of gratitude or awareness, it's a neurological pattern. The mind has learned to trust negativity more than stability. It has learned that disappointment is predictable, and predictability feels safe. Another powerful psychological force at play is cognitive distortion, particularly all-or-nothing thinking. People who struggle with feelings of inadequacy often interpret their worth in extreme terms: perfect or worthless, success or failure, admired or rejected. There is no middle ground. This creates a mental environment where even a small mistake feels catastrophic because the brain translates it into a global truth about the self. If one thing goes wrong, the entire identity collapses into "I'm not good enough." This distorted thinking becomes automatic, operating silently in the background until it becomes the default narrative. Even more subtle and more dangerous is the internal confirmation bias. The brain actively searches for evidence that supports the belief, "I'm not enough," and filters out anything that contradicts it. If someone compliments them, they call it pity. If someone shows interest, they assume it won't last. If they succeed at something, they attribute it to luck or timing rather than ability. The brain is not trying to torture them. It's trying to maintain the worldview it has learned. Familiar pain becomes more comfortable than unknown acceptance. Trauma deepens this mental rigidity. People who grew up with emotional neglect or unpredictability often develop what psychologists call anticipatory self-protection. They constantly prepare for failure or rejection before it happens. This creates a mental habit where they downplay achievements, lower expectations, and avoid vulnerability as a way of staying safe. They believe that if they expect disappointment, they won't be hurt by it. But in reality, this mindset only reinforces the belief that they aren't worthy of good things. The mind becomes a self-contained echo chamber of inadequacy. This psychological pattern also affects relationships. When someone carries an internal sense of "not enough," their brain becomes hypersensitive to perceived criticism or withdrawal. A partner's bad mood might be misinterpreted as personal fault. A lack of immediate appreciation feels like rejection. They overanalyze every silence, every gesture, every inconsistency, because the mind has been trained to look for signs of danger. This leads to overthinking, over-apologizing, or emotional retreat. Even when their partner offers reassurance, the mind rejects it because it doesn't fit the internal narrative. The darker truth is that chronic inadequacy becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. When the brain expects rejection, it interprets neutral interactions as negative. When it expects failure, it magnifies minor mistakes. When it expects not to be enough, it subconsciously sabotages opportunities to avoid the risk of being proven right. These internal mechanisms trap the person in a cycle where the world confirms their fears, not because the world is cruel, but because their mind shapes how they perceive it. This rejection of positivity isn't just emotional, it's physiological. Studies show that people with deep-rooted self-doubt experience decreased activation in the brain's reward circuitry when receiving praise. Their neurons literally don't fire the same way someone else's might. Their brain interprets kindness as unfamiliar, unpredictable, or undeserved. The discomfort they feel when someone treats them well isn't arrogance or avoidance. It's neurological misalignment. Their mind doesn't know where to place positive information, so it pushes it away. Another important factor is what psychologists call emotional incongruence. When external feedback doesn't match internal belief, the mind chooses the belief. If someone with inadequacy issues receives praise, it clashes with the internal narrative that they're flawed or unworthy. This conflict creates anxiety, and the brain resolves the anxiety by rejecting the praise. It's not that they don't want to believe good things about themselves. They simply don't know how. These individuals often become overly self-reliant because relying on others feels dangerous. Dependence opens the door to disappointment, so they learn to minimize their needs. They rarely ask for help, rarely express vulnerability, rarely allow themselves to be comforted. They build emotional walls, not out of coldness, but out of protection. To them, allowing positive connection feels like walking into a trap. The mind would rather keep them alone than risk being hurt again. Yet beneath all of these patterns lies a simple truth. The brain is not the enemy. It is trying to protect them using outdated strategies learned in childhood. The mind clings to inadequacy because it believes the belief keeps them safe. It believes that expecting the worst prevents future pain. It believes that staying small avoids criticism. These are survival mechanisms, not flaws. But what once protected them now restricts them. Understanding these mental processes is the first step toward rewiring them. The brain can learn new patterns. It can learn to accept positivity, to integrate compliments, to trust internal worth rather than external validation. But it starts with awareness. Awareness that the voice saying, "You're not enough," is not truth, but trauma. It is not identity, but conditioning. And conditioning can be unlearned, one belief at a time. The moment someone begins to believe they are not enough, a quiet but powerful shift happens inside the mind. What begins as a belief slowly becomes an identity, and once inadequacy becomes part of a person's identity, self-sabotage follows like a shadow. It doesn't appear as a dramatic meltdown or an obvious collapse. Instead, it appears in subtle behaviors, hesitation, avoidance, perfectionism, pushing people away, or holding back just enough to never fully succeed. These actions rarely feel like sabotage in the moment. They feel like protection. But beneath that illusion lies a darker psychological loop that keeps a person trapped in the same patterns, unable to break free. People who feel chronically inadequate often live with a kind of internal tension, an unresolved conflict between who they want to be and who they secretly believe they are. This tension creates emotional pressure, and the mind looks for ways to relieve it. Self-sabotage becomes one of the easiest ways to restore balance. If they fear they're not good enough for a relationship, they might withdraw emotionally or become overly accommodating until resentment builds. If they fear they cannot succeed at a goal, they procrastinate until failure becomes inevitable. The failure becomes proof of their belief, and the cycle continues. In psychology, this is known as self-verification, the tendency to behave in ways that confirm what we already believe about ourselves, even if those beliefs harm us. This loop becomes especially strong when someone associates success with exposure. For people who feel inadequate, success is threatening because it brings attention. It raises expectations. It removes excuses. As long as they remain small, quiet, unseen, they can avoid judgment or disappointment. Success requires visibility, vulnerability, and accountability. Things that feel dangerous to someone conditioned to expect rejection. So they pull back. They delay. They sabotage opportunities by convincing themselves they're not ready, not skilled enough, not deserving. They tell themselves, "I'll start when I feel more confident," not realizing that confidence doesn't arrive before action. It arrives because of action. In relationships, self-sabotage often takes the form of emotional withdrawal. Someone may fear abandonment so deeply that they leave before they can be left. They may test their partner's love by creating conflict, expecting to be rejected. They may choose partners who are emotionally unavailable because it feels familiar. If love feels too warm, too stable, or too genuine, they interpret it as temporary or suspicious. They have been conditioned to associate affection with unpredictability, so stability feels unreal. This leads them to push away the very people who could help them heal. They aren't rejecting love, they're rejecting the threat of losing it. Another common form of self-sabotage is perfectionism masquerading as productivity. Perfectionism isn't a desire to do well. It's a fear of being seen failing. For someone who feels inadequate, anything less than perfect feels like confirmation of their deepest fear, that they're not enough. This leads to a cycle where goals are set too high, and any progress short of perfection feels worthless. They burn out, collapse, or quit entirely, telling themselves they just weren't cut out for it. In reality, they created standards that guaranteed failure. This failure then becomes evidence that supports their original belief that a darker layer emerges when inadequacy becomes a source of identity stability. When someone has lived years, or even decades, believing they are not enough, the belief becomes familiar, almost comforting. The mind is more comfortable with predictable pain than unpredictable joy. Predictable pain allows a person to maintain a sense of control. If they already expect disappointment, they cannot be surprised by it. This is why self-sabotage does not feel like destruction. It feels like safety. It feels like staying within the bounds of what they know. If they try to grow beyond their emotional conditioning, the mind pulls them back to the familiar, even if the familiar is harmful. Some people sabotage themselves by shrinking emotionally in social or professional settings. They stay quiet in meetings, hide their talents, or defer to others even when they have valuable ideas. They fear being exposed as incompetent, so they avoid situations where their abilities could be tested. This avoidance reinforces the belief that they lack ability because they never give themselves the chance to see otherwise. Over time, their life becomes smaller, not because they lack potential, but because their mind equates visibility with vulnerability. Others sabotage themselves through emotional overextension. They become the person who always helps others, always says yes, always prioritizes someone else's needs. This behavior creates a sense of usefulness that temporarily alleviates feelings of inadequacy. But in doing so, they deplete themselves, neglect their own growth, and build relationships where their worth is tied to what they can provide. When they cannot keep giving, they feel guilty, worthless, or replaceable, once again reinforcing the belief that they are not enough unless they are serving others. This becomes a form of self-erasure disguised as kindness. There is also the self-sabotage that comes from emotional predictability. A person might stay in toxic environments, jobs, friendships, or relationships because they align with the belief that they are undeserving of better. They may ignore red flags not because they don't see them, but because they subconsciously believe this is the best they can get. Healthy environments feel unfamiliar, and unfamiliar feels unsafe. So they gravitate toward the very situations that confirm their negative self-image. It's not a conscious choice. It's a psychological reflex rooted in early emotional conditioning. Over time, self-sabotage becomes a ritual. They expect failure, so they unconsciously create conditions for it. They expect rejection, so they behave in ways that push others away. They expect disappointment, so they sabotage opportunities that could lead to success. And every time the cycle repeats, the belief grows stronger. They tell themselves it's fate, or bad luck, or just how things always go for me, not realizing that the real enemy is the belief system steering their choices. Yet the most heartbreaking part is this. People who live in chronic inadequacy rarely see their self-sabotage for what it is. They don't realize how often they get in their own way. They don't recognize the ways their mind distorts their reality, convincing them that they're incapable, unworthy, or destined to fail. They're not trying to destroy their life. They're trying to protect themselves from emotional pain. They're trying to avoid the shame of being exposed as not enough. And so they shrink, withdraw, delay, perfect, overthink, overgive, or run away. Self-sabotage isn't a flaw. It's a defense mechanism. It's